Hi, Mickey.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing okay. I ran out of shaving cream, so I got a little bit of the George Clooney Syriana look. Unfortunately, not enough of the George Clooney look, but
yeah, so you watched the Oscars too, huh?
I did.
You know, if Brokeback Mountain had won for Best Picture, I think that would have guaranteed it clearing the 100 million gross mark. And given the fact that you famously predicted it wouldn't exceed 50 million, that would have pretty much sealed your reputation as a poor prognosticator of the fortunes of gay cowboy movies. So
it would have, but it didn't happen, did it?
No, it must have been with a sigh of relief that you saw that crash at one, right? You were happy.
And B, I haven't seen Crash. I hear mixed things about it. And B, I'm not sure it would have made 100 million. It was sort of stumbling. It didn't get any much of a bump from being nominated from the Oscars, so it's not clear it would have gotten such a big bump.
It's at 80 million. I think Best Picture would have done it. 80 million still pulling into several million a week, but
it would have been close.
In any event, you were relieved, I'm sure. Right?
It was the lowest rated Oscars, second lowest rated since 1987. So it's not clear that it really, directs millions of people into the theaters the way maybe it wants to.
I see you have been giving this some thought, as I suspected.
But I didn't. Crash is. I probably hate Crash too. I mean, my line is if Brokeback just wasn't that good a movie, and everybody's writing these pieces saying, "Oh, this shows that Hollywood is homophobic." I don't think it shows that. It may show that Hollywood is scared that America is homophobic and didn't want to award the prize to this film that they thought America might hate. But I think ultimately, I give them the benefit of the doubt. I think they decided it wasn't that good a film, and if it had achieved artistically, what it set out to do, I would not have minded it winning the Oscar at all.
Even if that had proved bad for your reputation.
Yes, I would.
That's the kind of guy you are.
I'll sacrifice my reputation to the higher culture of Hollywood.
That's why you're the guy I converse with on international TV, Mickey.
I know that, Bob.
Any other Oscar thoughts? I thought George Clooney should have looked a little more taken aback when he won his Oscar. Didn't you think he was a little too cool and collected? I mean, you don't want to carry it to kind of Gwyneth Paltrow extremes of phony breathlessness, but seeming a little excited and
that's just the way he
surprised.
Is. That's just the way he is, and he was pissed off that Jon Stewart had said Hollywood was out of touch, so he was ready with his rebuttal, which of course was wrong on a major point. It said that Hollywood was out front on AIDS, and Hollywood was nowhere near out front on AIDS. There's a web item I just read that showed that Hollywood first weighed in 1990, which was about 7 years after it had been on the cover of Newsweek.
Wait a second. So you think that little talk was impromptu about how progressive Hollywood had been?
No, he obviously had it ready, but it was triggered by Jon Stewart's joke about how out of touch Hollywood was. Because I think it was like, it was triggered. It triggered this save get key, and Clooney is always cool. He's a cool character.
Yeah, I thought a little too cool for his own good, personally, but
I don't think he did himself any harm.
You don't think he did? Did anyone do themselves harm? What did you think of Jon Stewart?
He was a little duller than I expected. Yes, I think he did himself a little bit of harm because I think
somehow the guys who aren't true stand-up comics like him and Letterman somehow are not quite as much on the wavelength of that gathering as the Billy Crystals of the world.
I thought he was snuffed out by the producers. I mean, I thought they had him on a very tight leash, and he even rebelled against it at one point. And they were just. I think Hollywood was terrified that this would be perceived as the liberal political Oscars. And they did everything they could to stop that impression from not giving Brokeback Mountain the award to putting Jon Stewart on chloroform to boring us to death with these long montages of old clips.
I thought he was pretty good. I also thought that. The fake attack ads were funny, which presumably were his inspiration. They looked like they were right out of the Daily Show.
Very funny, and the clip of gay cowboy movies.
I was watching with my kids, so that took a little of the mirth out of that for me. But I could see how, in another context, I would have thought that was funny. And it wasn't the gayness of it. I mean,
did your kids know what was going on?
One did, one didn't. But anyway, it wasn't the gayness of it. It was that it was about sex and not love. That was a little awkward.
Right.
We've explained gay love to them.
Anyway, so I don't know. What's interesting to me is all the people who are saying, "Oh, this proves Hollywood is homophobic," which seems crazy to me.
Yeah.
I mean, it may be that America is homophobic. I think I've argued that, but my instinct is that Nikki Fink and Ken Turan have both argued, well, these macho producers all didn't want to see the film. They're all too macho and homophobic, and that seems implausible to me. But that was my take.
Well, for all we know, Brokeback was a close second, right? There was, in one of the montages of old movies, I saw something that I think we might be able to use as kind of almost our logo, and if I can find it, I'll stick it in.
Okay.
So I think we've taken care of Hollywood.
Yeah. Now, next on our agenda is India.
Land of contrasts.
Yes, and you and David had pissed on the deal with the Bush cut with India, and since then I've read a piece by Simon Jenkins in the Times, who's no friend of Bush, and he says this was Bush has stumbled on an ace in the hole.
And what was so great about the deal, according to him?
Two reasons. First, the counterweight to China argument he made, and I guess you could make some arguments that it helps to have India as a counterweight to China, because if China becomes our dominant trading partner and makes all our manufactured goods and has no competition in the world, they have a sort of OPEC-like power over us that they don't if there's another big manufacturing power that can supply our manufacturing
needs.
A
second, Mickey.
And the second point, let me get both points out and then you can respond. The second point is that the non-proliferation treaty that didn't work anyway, and now we just have acknowledged it didn't work, and we have to this is a new model for dealing with countries that always had a way out of the non-proliferation treaty.
Yeah, it is
anyway,
a new model
stop.
because unlike the NPT, it seems designed to actually accelerate the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But first on the first point, before I return to that,
right.
Look, whether India. First of all, India's economy is in a lot of ways more complementary to China's than redundant. Okay, in terms of the types of jobs, but. Whether it becomes a usefully redundant economy is going to be shaped by the market. I mean, we're not going to say, hey, could you guys open up a few auto factories? There's too many of them in China. I mean, did Jenkins make that argument? That's ridiculous.
I assume the argument is if China gets really mad at us at some point over Taiwan and says, well, we now make all your shoes, and if you don't let us take over Taiwan, you're not going to have anything to wear.
Fine, but
we can now say, sorry, India makes half our shoes. Tough luck.
Well, look, Mickey, it's in our interest to encourage the economic development of India regardless. And that part of the deal I don't have any trouble with.
Right.
Not that would allow us to do in some fine-tuning way what you seem to think we could do, which is like a range for certain products to be made in India.
No, I just think it helps to be friendly with as many trading partners as possible.
It helps for commerce to flourish around the world, and of course we should encourage that in India. That's not the controversial part of the deal. As for the nukes, I mean, here's the way. Republicans are always saying that Democrats are stuck in a pre-9/11 world. I think this proves beyond a doubt that Bush is stuck in a pre-9/11 world, because. The post-9/11, I mean, I believed this before 9/11, but I think, lots of people say it now accurately, the greatest threat to national security is terrorists getting a hold of nuclear or biological weapons, okay? So constraining proliferation is very much in our interests. Now, before 9/11, the mainstream thinking, certainly among Bushies, was kind of vestigial Cold War thinking, You got to counterbalance a country like China, especially given its communist past, and so you got to have these other great powers that are on our side. Well, this represented the clear triumph of that pre-9/11 kind of thinking over the post-9/11 kind of thinking, okay? I mean, we got taken completely to the cleaners on the nuclear proliferation front, all for the sake of some strategic alliance with India that's supposed to help us in some way that I can't imagine, and I'll later ask you to come up with some scenario where it would actually help us, and I hope it'll be more persuasive than the first one you came up with.
I already gave it my best shot.
Well, okay. Anyway, as for the proliferation, you know, the way this went was, the deal we offered India was, okay, we'll give you nuclear materials, and all we ask is that you quit producing nuclear weapons, since you've already got quite a few, after all, enough for deterrence. They said, no, we want to keep making nuclear weapons. So Bush said, okay, you can keep making nuclear weapons, but we'd like you to confine it to like a couple of reactors, and one or two or whatever it was, and then that would have meant that they could only produce a handful of nuclear weapons per year. And they said, no, we actually want a whole bunch. We want like 6 or 8 or something to be producing nuclear weapons. That means that they can produce dozens of nuclear weapons a year. So Bush said, well, okay, fine. I mean, he was just totally taken to the cleaners. Explain to me what we got in return.
Well, I know very little about nuclear proliferation, but what was there to stop India, if we hadn't had this deal, from making as many bombs as they wanted?
Well, they were making as many as they wanted before. They're making as many now. It's just that now we're providing them with nuclear material for their non-military uses of nuclear material, so that they don't have to worry about some finite supply. Okay, and B, they have our blessing. We're blessing this whole project, even though A, they first started developing nuclear weapons in violation of an international agreement they had signed, even though they weren't part of the NPT. B, you know, we've blessed the idea that, you know, if you want nukes, just opt out of the NPT. So, in other words, we're basically encouraging Iran to do that. C, we're driving home a major talking point for people like Iran, which is that, look, we only mind if Muslim countries get nuclear weapons. Okay, now, of course, that there is a separate rationale for putting India in a separate category from Iran. And in fact, in this Rich Lowry piece that you attuned me to, he says that this has prompted charges of hypocrisy. How can we bless India's nuclear breakout while trying to stifle North Korea's and Iran's? But there should be privileges to being a democratic, responsible government presiding over an open society. Non-proliferation advocates worry about the signal sent to the rest of the world by the deal.
Right. So
that message should be, create a consistent record of decent governments, and we won't be alarmed if you pursue nukes. Well, maybe that's what it should be, but that's not how it's going to play. It's going to be a major talking point in Iran, among the Iranians, throughout the Muslim world, and kind of to drive it home, as if to drive this home, Bush goes from India to Pakistan and there announces that, no, you guys aren't getting anything. You're not getting any help with your nuclear program. And of course, everyone there is going to say it's because we're Muslim, so it helps the radicals there. Further helping the radicals there is the fact that Bush humiliates Musharraf, right, whom in theory Bush wants to prop up, to the extent that he looks humiliated, that he looks like he's not getting anything out of his partnership with the U.S. That's good for the radicals in Pakistan. I mean, all of this, it was just lose, lose, lose. And you're right that it's not as if weapons proliferation was under control in India or anywhere else otherwise, but, and this is a point that emerged on the America Abroad blog, one of the TPM blogs, in posts by, I think, Ivo Dalder and Jim Steinberg. I forget which one said exactly which, but it's, you know, as people are paying attention agree, I think, everyone that's not on the far right, you know, we need a successor to the NPT. The NPT had slowly fallen apart, and any responsible American administration would be using this opportunity and other opportunities they've had to craft something tougher than the NPT and figuring out a way for it to actually work. Bush does not believe in arms control, and that's why he doesn't really care what any of this implies for arms control.
Well, first, sending a message to the world that we'll let you have nukes if you become a nice democracy with a stable tradition ain't such a bad message to send, and it's hard to believe that the Iranians don't recognize that that's another distinction between them and India. And Pakistan falls on the wrong side of that line because they're not a democracy. They're a military dictatorship.
Oh, no, there are lines you can draw that indeed distinguish among these countries. The question is how it will be received.
Second, I don't disagree with anything you said, but it seems to me that it's a little bit of a striped pants cold mentality to say, oh, well, we can fashion a new NPT without looking at the concrete power realities on the ground, which are that India was going to do whatever the heck it wanted, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. So how are we going to rope them into a treaty that they don't want to be in?
No, you can imagine incentives that would do it. I think in the long run, membership in good standing in the WTO should be dependent on abiding by nuclear, in general, arms control regimes, and the regime should be new and tougher. We're going to have to do that, or things are going to get very messy. Jim Steinberg in his post mentions one novel thing where you monitor both the inflow to the outflow, and the outflow even in countries like India that have a thing, that have a nuclear infrastructure. But anyway, there's all kinds of things you can imagine. But the point is, this administration just doesn't discuss the subject. They do not believe in arms control. It's a John Bolton administration.
Does it not do any good that we get to inspect their civilian plants? We could presumably look and make sure that no material is leaking from them. Or
we know India's not. India is not leaking nuclear weapons and selling them to terrorists. We know that.
What about the argument?
In Pakistan, that would be useful.
What about the argument that
India... But he's not doing a deal with Pakistan.
India has a vast Muslim population, so we're not exactly discriminating against Muslims.
Well, that's just not the way the talking point's going to work. I mean, one country is governed and ruled by non-Muslims, and two of them are not. And I guarantee you that that's the way the talking points are going to work out. I agree that many in the Iranian government are astute enough to recognize that this actually is a distinction between India and Iran. India's been a responsible democracy. That's just not the way it's going to play out rhetorically. And that's especially the case if you look at Israel, which is their big talking point, of course, where we've agreed to look the other way, and even though they have nuclear weapons. And I assure you that talking point has huge resonance throughout the Muslim world, and we're never going to change that.
And why do you think the Bush administration made this horrible faux pas?
Because they're stuck in Cold War thinking, where they think it's this kind of Kissingerian world where, we need somebody to balance China's power. They don't understand that really the threat of war among great powers is lower than it's ever been. It's a more manageable problem than it's ever been. That's characteristic of the modern world. But there is a big threat that replaces it, and that is terrorists and nuclear weapons, which they pay no real, substantial, positive attention to. I mean, again, try to imagine a thought experiment. Give me a scenario where the fact that we're helping India out by giving them the free nuclear materials or selling them nuclear materials or whatever we're doing, how that helps us out in counterbalancing China. I mean, they're not going to go to the mat over Taiwan. They are famously indifferent to the Taiwan question, and this isn't going to change their mind. And even if it temporarily does, I mean, India's a democracy. 5 years down the road, they may have a new government who we didn't even do this deal with. I just cannot imagine a scenario where this so-called counterbalancing really matters in a big way. That is to say, where what we've done would really make the difference between India doing something very valuable to us and them not doing something very valuable to us. Maybe readers can send in scenarios. That'd be an interesting question.
If they can retake retake the Himalayas from China when China attacks Taiwan, thereby diverting the Chinese military. I don't know.
In theory they could. I just think that whether they're in the mood to is not going to be determined by this little trip Bush took.
Yeah. No, I tend to sympathize. I never understand it these days when people talk about balance of power and White House to be friendly.
Pre-9/11 worldview, and Republicans are more guilty by and large than Democrats.
Although Democrats are often guilty of it too.
They can be. Some of them are guilty in another sense, which is they don't appreciate the gravity of the terrorism threat, I think.
I suspect John Kerry is not exactly up to speed with you on all this, but he's history. So I agree with you. I have nothing to say. I defer to your greater expertise.
Well, according to my records, we now move on to something that we're not going to agree on.
That's correct.
That would be Ann Coulter.
Yeah, you must feel you haven't done well enough in the past because you're coming back for the third bite of the apple where you try to browbeat me into
I just felt we needed
repudiating this woman.
I just felt we needed closure, but I'll tell you something, Mickey. I meditated this morning, so there's no way I'm going to lose my cool this time as I did last time. I'm going to be a picture of serenity, even as you defame my name.
I thought you were serene in your
Did you?
apoplexy last time.
Yeah. Thank you. Not
But
all viewers
anyway,
did.
But what do we have to talk about? I mean, I have some esprit de l'escalier about what I said, and I think I have better ways to put what I've said. But
why don't you start with putting it in English? What was that term you threw out there?
Spirit of the staircase. I probably mangled it. It means second thoughts.
Oh.
So I had some second thoughts.
Okay, I know what that phrase means.
Anyway.
Who should go first?
I mean, my point is, you go first.
I don't have much to say. I want you to affirm that I was not being merely pettily self-defensive by confirming that long before Ann Coulter attacked me personally, I had said to you, I don't see how you associate with that woman, and I don't think you should, right?
You're not the only person, but my line is, basically what she says are not opinions that should be outside the bounds of reasonable debate. She thinks Islam is not a religion of peace. You're writing a book, presumably you know that that's not true. But one can conceive of a religion that's not a religion of peace. So maybe one day one of those will come along. And there's an argument about whether Islam is that religion or not. It seems like a reasonable argument to have. I think you do more to defang Ann Coulter if you argue with her and try to understand where she's coming from and understand her worldview than you do just by saying we have to cut her off. You bend over backwards to understand, rightly, to understand the worldview of terrorists. Why not bend over backwards to understand the worldview of Ann Coulter?
Because it's more baffling and pernicious? Just kidding, of course.
I mean, if she ever said anything racist or hideous, I wouldn't associate with her.
Well, I'll tell you, actually, even in the
but she has never done that.
Where she denounced me. And by the way, I went back and looked at the video of that, which I hadn't done before, and it actually seemed like a less big deal. She seemed more kind of pathetic than when reading the transcript. But in that, she calls the writing Muslims savages. I don't know if you're familiar with the history of that term, but it basically arose in the 19th century, back when the belief, and it referred to people who lived in like hunter-gatherer societies, and the belief was that they were biologically inferior, and the term was used that way. And the term is not used now by anyone but Ann Coulter.
It could be culturally inferior, and you wrote a whole book, if I remember, saying that some cultures are more sophisticated than others.
Actually, I don't think I ever put it that way, but in any event, no, Mickey, I'm telling you, that's not the way the term was used the last time it was used by anyone. Ann Coulter is revising a term.
She was talking about rioters, Bob, who were killing people and burning people over a cartoon.
Well,
that seems a much more reasonable application of the word savages. If she'd referred to all Muslims as savages, I would agree with you.
Not all the rioters were
that.
killing and burning people, but in any event, are you saying that they were doing that because they're biologically inferior, Mickey?
No, of course not.
Well, I'm telling you, that's what the language she used meant the last time anybody was using it.
These days, she's the only one who
does.
They were behaving savagely because people were dying over a cartoon. And that doesn't seem an insane position to take.
Okay, let me get back to your point. You said she believes that Islam is not a religion of peace. She goes further than that, okay? She says we should invade Muslim countries and convert them to Christianity, which is far from following from the premise, right? That doesn't follow automatically from the premise that Islam is a religion.
She said that before
what?
She was talking about Afghanistan, and by, as she points out, she said we should invade their countries, kill their leaders, and convert them to Christianity, and we did two of the three. We did invade their countries, and we toppled the Taliban.
What, you're saying she was just talking about Afghanistan?
That was the context in which she first said it.
Can I tell you something? This arose in our last conversation.
No, I understand. I understand that now she has reaffirmed it, but I don't know quite to what country she was referring to when
since she reaffirmed it in 2003 and said, I am often asked if I still think we should invade their countries, plural. This is after the Afghanistan war, so she wasn't talking about Afghanistan. She says in 2003, I'm often asked if I still think we should invade their countries, kill their leaders, and convert them to Christianity. The answer is now more than ever. Well, coincidentally, in 2003, we did invade a Muslim country, and I'm pretty sure that if upon invading we had said, by the way, we're going to convert you to Christianity at gunpoint, that would not have made things go any more smoothly than they've gone, which is unsmoothly enough, thanks. So her position still is, Mickey, that we should invade Muslim countries and kill their leaders and convert them to Christianity.
I reject
that's not
that.
That's not a serious argument.
I reject that position, and I don't think she means it entirely seriously.
But there's another point I brought up, which is that she practices McCarthyism, pure and simple. When she dismisses people who disagree with her, like me, by saying they have affection for terrorists, that means they are sympathizing with the enemy, exactly what Joseph McCarthy said. She says it on the basis of no good evidence, just as Joseph McCarthy did. Do you agree with me?
I actually watched the videotape, and I, if she wanted to accuse you of treason, that's not a charge she has trouble making. She would have called you a traitor. I think this was a relatively sincere attempt on her part to show that Democrats, and she was conflating you with Democrats, bend over backwards to understand terrorists the same way the charge might legitimately be made. It was illegitimate in your case, but it was legitimately be made about a movie like Paradise Now, for example.
Well, first of all, you disagreed it was illegitimate in my case. Secondly, she couldn't put it...
I disagree with it, yes.
She could have put it the way you put it. That's very different from saying that people have affection for terrorists, because, and you know what message she's trying to send there. She's trying to say that you identify with the goals of terrorists. The way she wants that read when she says you have affection for terrorists is not that you actually know and like individual terrorists. She wants people to think that you support the goals of Al-Qaeda. That is exactly what that message says, especially when it's going over Fox TV, which is Fox News, which is where it came from. That is indistinguishable from McCarthyism, Mickey. I can't believe you're arguing that there is any difference at all. And I can't believe you would say that Joseph McCarthy is somebody that decent people should have been associated with in the 50s.
She's actually written a book defending Joseph McCarthy, so it's hard to
we don't need to elaborate.
Believe in McCarthyism, but
I know she wouldn't agree with me, Mickey.
But I think there was a non-McCarthyist argument she was making. She was saying you bend over too far to be compassionate with these people. And I think there is while I generally agree with the Bob Wright worldview, there is a problem with the Bob Wright worldview, which is the people who get all this compassionate understanding are the people who blow things up. So when you were talking about Bush's trip to Asia with David Corn, you're saying, oh, it's a disaster because there have been a couple of bombs in Pakistan. Well, you set off a couple of bombs, and all of a sudden you go into a flurry of compassion and understanding. That is a problem because you create a perverse incentive that the violent people are the people that get all the attention. I'm not saying it's a cause for disagreeing with your worldview. I'm saying it's something to worry about. And she was harping on that. She was basically making the critique of you that one would make about a film like Paradise Now, which I would probably also defend. I haven't seen it.
No, I haven't seen it either.
I think you should be able to make that critique. I don't think it means you're a McCarthyist. If she wanted to say you agree with the aims of Al-Qaeda, she would probably say you agree with the aims of Al-Qaeda.
Well, no, because that is so absolutely manifestly indefensible. She wants to say things that seem as if conceivably they could be true, but send the same message, and are in fact false, of course. I mean, she's not a serious person. And when I saw that video, the reason actually, I wouldn't say affection welled up for her, but a little sympathy did, which before that I would have thought was as unlikely as me sympathizing with terrorists. And it was because I could just see exactly her story. We all become what we get positive feedback for through our lives. And I could see how in junior high and high school, she was the girl who would say the outrageous thing. And that's how she got attention. And she was a little more clever than the average student, so they were cleverly outrageous things. And that's all she is and all she has become. She's never contributed a constructive thought that I'm aware of. And it's just...
That's just not true, Bob.
What was your example last time of a constructive thought?
You read her column. Her column on profiling was the one I was talking about. That she said it was insane.
Airports.
She said it was insane not to do ethnic profiling in airports. I think she was right about that.
She said it's crazy to keep pulling aside grandmothers, right?
No, she said it's crazy if all the terrorist attacks are committed by young Arab males. We should be on the lookout for young Arab males. That seems eminent common sense to me. It doesn't mean you hate young Arab males. It means that they are the perpetrators, the same way as if somebody was murdered by a red-headed white guy and he was seen fleeing, you go chasing after red-headed white people.
Well, I mean, actually, the way she put that rhetorically, according to your previous account of it, I didn't read it myself, was that she said, look, it's crazy to keep pulling aside grandmothers. And that kind of works rhetorically, because you go through the airport and you've seen these old women pulled aside and you're going, I don't think that's too likely. But what that actually does is just confuse the issue, because what she's talking about is making the profiling sensitive to ethnicity. And when you see a grandmother, what you think is crazy is that she's a woman and she's old. That's why you think she's unlikely. So in the guise of making an argument that we focus on Muslims, she's saying, isn't it crazy to focus on old women? Well, those are two different dimensions, and that's an example of how, she's just not really contributing to clear and honest debate. Leaving aside the fact that I disagree with his policy, and it didn't take a genius to come up with this idea. I mean, this is all over.
You're forgetting your yoga.
Oh, I've been so much more calm than last time. This is a revolution.
A couple of vinyasas, I think, are in order. But she's saying it's a crazy policy. It's crazy in these two dimensions. She's picking the most outrageous.
Well, that's not an original thought.
That's standard political rhetoric. What I meant when I said that I got into trouble because I agree that you could not conclude from your article. One should not conclude from your article that you have affection for terrorists. But I thought it was standard political hyperbole. It's as if I said you and David Corn had a love-in the last time on Blogging
come on, Mickey.
I don't really mean that you
someone
and
has affection
David Corn
for terrorists, and you're telling me it's as innocuous as saying those two guys had a love-in while discussing this. Come on, Mickey.
It's a standard political trope to pick the worst example to exaggerate things for rhetorical effect, and B, to pick the worst example of your opponent's position. So if they're searching grandmothers, you pick out the searching grandmothers, even though you're right that there's this additional issue of ethnicity. You're criticizing her for doing standard political argument things that people on both sides do every day. I'm saying that she sometimes has a whole lot to contribute. Her article on Thomas Jefferson's genealogy was great. It broke new ground. If you read her column is just not offensive, and it's quite funny, and it's provocative, and it often says very sensible things that nobody else is willing to say.
That was a G. No, nothing. Listen, we should probably move on. I would only be repeating myself if I continued, although I would maintain my Zen-like calm throughout.
Okay.
We should move on to some another person on the right who annoys me.
Okay.
This was actually kind of your idea, to bring up this Fukuyama thing, especially in the context of the Hitchens critique. But it works well because last time I very briefly maligned Hitchens and didn't have time to elaborate, and somebody wrote in defying me to elaborate and establish that he was incoherent. So I'll try to do that now. I should say that actually the thing that most annoys me about Hitchens is that, A, he was one of these people who, before the Iraq War...
Bob, we should set the context, which is that Fukuyama wrote this article saying he was wrong about the Iraq War and he could no longer be part of the neoconservative movement.
True.
And Hitchens wrote a piece at Slate attacking him for recanting.
That's true, although what I was about to say is a generic annoyance.
Okay, sorry.
That Hitchens, before the Iraq War, he was contemptuous of people who didn't think we should invade Iraq, okay? And that's annoying enough, actually. But, years down the road, when there's a lot of evidence that people who opposed the war weren't crazy, he is just as contemptuous as he ever was of anyone who opposed the war. And that takes, I don't know, that takes explaining it. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe people who know him better than I do can tell me how he maintains so steadfastly oblivious to reality. But anyway, on this...
He's not just as contemptuous. He says we underestimated the ferocity of the opposition.
No, but when he attacks somebody, and the Fukuyama thing's a good example. Fukuyama was actually kind of on the fence before the war, I think. But he is now, criticizing neocons and the whole war idea in very severe terms, and so that's what led Hitchens to light out after him. So anyway, here's this Hitchens piece. As you said, Fukuyama does this thing critiquing neoconservatism, saying we need something new. They got us into this war, which was a terrible idea, and so on. So, first of all, Hitchens, he spends a lot of time in this piece just kind of making fun of Fukuyama's language. It's kind of a literary critique or something, and he manages to kind of show off how much he knows about, the Bolshevik Revolution and stuff in the process. He complains that Fukuyama uses the term magnet to say that Iraq has become a magnet for terrorists. Instead, by his slack use of terms like magnet, he, that is Fukuyama, concedes to the fanatics and beheaders the claim that they are a response to American blunders and excesses. Now, by this logic, it's not much of an extension of this logic to say that you're never allowed to criticize American policy as having played into the hands of the terrorists, because then it will give them the satisfaction of knowing, you know, blah, blah, blah. That's what he's saying here. This apparently is what's wrong with what Fukuyama did. Not that Fukuyama's wrong. It's just that it will give terrorists satisfaction to hear this debate. So we shouldn't say it. Well, that's a pretty much an old that would end a lot of debates that I'm sure Hitchens would like to see ended. But worse than that,
I thought what he was saying there was that Fukuyama is surprisingly willing to accept the sort of the most cliched, stock, off-the-shelf critiques of the Iraq War. He doesn't formulate his own critique. He just sort of buys. It's as if he reprints half the Huffington Post at the beginning of his piece.
That's what he said a few paragraphs earlier than this. And first of all, there's a reason that the idea that Iraq has become a magnet for terrorists is now a cliche. It's because it's so true that a lot of people have repeated it. And if Hitchens is denying it, that's further evidence that he's lost touch. There are other metaphors I like more, because magnet doesn't convey the idea that terrorism is replicating itself. It doesn't convey the incubator concept, which is also going on.
A magnet could be like flypaper.
Yeah, it turns out not to be, apparently, but could be.
We reject the flypaper.
Could be. Yeah. Anyway, but again, all he says is it's a cliche. You know, he doesn't argue
but that was
a
weird thing about Fukuyama. But that plays into the critique of Fukuyama, which is he's just going with the flow and being fashionable. And there was something weird about his piece where he has this fashionable critique of Iraq, and Andrew Sullivan makes the same point. See, he adopts the fashionable critique of Iraq, says it's a disaster, and then at the end he says, oh, it might work out for the better. Well, if it might work out for the better, then maybe it's worth the sacrifice in American lives.
I don't understand why. At the end?
Yeah, I don't understand why he.
It's one of those throwaway lines where you want to leave yourself open so that you don't look like an idiot 5 years down the road. I think he clearly says at the beginning of the piece that the chances are very high that this is going to go down in history as a big mistake.
Right, but
that's his position.
At the end of the piece, he's unwilling to sacrifice the idea that democracy won't, in the long run, work out to be much better than the alternatives. And if he really believes the end of his piece, then he shouldn't have written what he wrote at the beginning of his piece. The beginning of his piece was, and this is Hitchens' charge, just a fashionable attempt to hook in New York Times readers and sell his book. That's the charge.
This is overwhelmingly his position now.
Okay.
Totally.
Well, you know more than I do.
But this is his actual position. He was on the fence. He made his big break with the neoconservatives before this book came out. This is where he is. But anyway, here's another. So I mean, again, Hitchens is just not addressing the argument. You can call it a cliche, but that's not addressing the argument. And there's another feature, and he has this in common with a lot of people like David Brooks, which is that as anti-American Muslim sentiment or terrorism or anything else gets worse and worse over the years, all they say is, see, we told you what a grave threat this was, rather than entertain the possibility that some American policy or some Western policy or something has made things worse. You saw this with the Hamas election, where people on the right say, see, we told you they hate Israel. Well, actually, Hamas probably wouldn't have won 3 or 4 years ago, and maybe you should examine the Israeli and American policies that have intervened. And so, too, with the stuff that Hitchens is talking about here. He says he says the last couple of weeks are an inopportune time for Fukuyama to mount this argument, because he says, first of all, surely the huge spasm of Islamist hysteria over characters published in Copenhagen shows that there is no possible Western insurance against doing something that will inflame jihadists. Well, wait a second. One could argue that had it not been for the Iraq War and various other things, the global Muslim temperature would not have been as close to the boiling point, and this never would have boiled over. I think that's a totally plausible argument. In any event, it merits consideration, but the Hitchenses of the world don't even acknowledge the possibility. And the next sentence is a real doozy. He says, the sheer audacity and evil of destroying the shrine of the 12th Imam is part of an inter-Muslim civil war that had begun long before the forces of al-Qaeda decided to exploit that war and also to export it to non-Muslim soil. Okay? Now remember, he's arguing against Fukuyama, who thinks the Iraq War was a bad idea, and his ace in the hole is the fact that these Sunni terrorists have blown up this Shiite mosque in Iraq. Now, to the naive observer, that explosion would seem to be part of the indictment of the war in Iraq, since obviously it would not have happened except for the war. But no. To Chris Hitchens, remember, it is proof that there was an inter-Muslim civil war that had begun long before the forces of al-Qaeda decided to exploit that war and also to export it to non-Muslim soil. Well, maybe he could point to us some examples of Sunnis blowing up a lot of Shiite shrines, before we invaded Iraq. I don't remember it happening on quite the scale it's been happening on lately.
The one point where I disagree, Hitchens is a critic of Israel's policy, so it's wrong to say.
Well, he was not the one I had in mind.
Okay, but it all comes. Maybe his defense of the Iraq War wasn't the most convincing. I often didn't follow his arguments well before the Iraq War, but it all comes down to whether we think the Iraq War might still work out. And the weird thing about all of these pieces, Fukuyama's and Sullivan's, Sullivan apologizes for the thousands who have died because of errors made by their superiors, and by writers like me.
I like that.
But then at the end, he says that the Iraq War might still work out. So it all hinges on whether the Iraq War.
Wait, didn't you just say this about Fukuyama? That must be going around.
Sorry?
Didn't you just say this about Fukuyama, too?
Well, it applies to both of them. Andrew's writing about Fukuyama's essay and endorsing it and saying, yes, he and I were both wrong and were responsible for the deaths of thousands, but, hey, it still might work out for the good in the long run of history. And my point is, if it works out for the good in the long run of history, it was worth the sacrifice of American life.
Well, yeah, then he'd say it was, but it's just a throwaway line. Again, I read the shorter blog version of Andrew's piece, so I think maybe I didn't see that part. I think it ended on the apology.
Yeah. Anyway, it all hinges on Iraq, so maybe we should turn to that.
Iraq, yes.
Today was a bad day in Iraq. Iraq, the model reports that they're mortaring his neighborhood.
Did I tell you the other day that mortaring scared me, or was I talking to David? That was
you were right. You were eerily prescient.
Yes, that's a scary threshold when they start mortaring anything other than the green zone.
That does seem, and that they seem to have crossed that threshold, yes.
That it's starting to seem just like Yugoslavia.
If you want to be very scared, go to Iraq, the model right now and read his latest post.
Yeah, worries me.
He has a very moving dialogue with his father, where his father basically says, hey, it's all hopeless. These people are in the grip of emotions, and they're not going to be able to suppress them. And he says, but wait, won't democracy work, and won't the Americans stop it? And his father says, no. So it's actually a pretty powerful piece of writing in the pessimistic vein. But go ahead.
Yeah, and he was an optimist, right?
Correct.
I mean, that's the favorite Iraqi blog of the right.
Correct, but he'll probably be back to being an optimist tomorrow. He tends to do that.
Yeah, but I'm worried. I mean, David Brooks has this line I heard on TV that, well, things are bad, but remember, we know a lot about civil wars now. We've observed a lot in recent decades. They only last 6 years. Oh, great. And B, that the way you solve them is you get the elites on both sides to be invested in a solution, and as long as they can profit from a solution, they can bring along the masses. Well, I mean, even if that's true, what scares me is that, yeah, you've got the elites on the Sunni side, the elites on the Shiite side. You've also got this third force for now, Zarqawi, and his interests don't align with either. He wants a civil war. It's his goal. And there had been a time, I mean, fairly recently, it had been said that he was kind of on the run. The Sunnis, the Iraqi Sunnis had turned on him, were trying to squeeze him out. And fine, maybe they'll get him and his organization out. But it seems to me, if they don't do that pretty soon, and the civil war does grow, then he will be back in the favor of the Sunnis, because once what they want to do is kill a bunch of Shiites and blow up Shiite mosques, he's very good at that. So it seems to me, if he doesn't disappear pretty soon, I'm going to get even more pessimistic than I am. And in any event, he's a massively complicating factor in the model that Brooks was trotting out.
The most interesting thing I read today was Fareed Zakaria's piece. He's pointed out, and this will be a fundamental shift in American strategy, that because our previous strategy is we build up their forces, and as they build up, we stand down. We build up the Iraqi military. But if the Iraqi military is seen by the Sunnis as basically a Shiite weapon that's used to kill them, building them up just exacerbates the civil war. And what Zakaria suggests is what we really want to do is stay in Iraq with our troops, but not build up the Iraqi troops for a while until they're seen as a neutral force for national unity. And basically we stick around and play the role of peacemakers, preventing the civil war from getting out of hand while we stop building up the Iraqi military. The problem, of course, as Ron Brownstein points out, is that this is at war with American popular opinion, which wants to get out as quickly as possible.
Well, there's also the problem that, you know, there's something kind of intrinsically aggravating about the intervention of U.S. troops. Now, apparently, the Sunnis are starting to find U.S. troops less offensive than they did back before they were worried about, you know, getting wiped out by the Shiites. But, you know, it's a very touchy thing to have Americans the ones who are intervening every day, and it also raises the question of, if the Americans can get to a point where they're not resented by the Sunnis, won't that mean they're basically protecting the Sunnis against the Shiites? Won't that mean that they will be resented by the Shiites? Man, I would hate to think that we've got to police this thing for years. That just seems to me like not a viable...
But it also throws a monkey wrench into the sort of Matt Iglesias Ariana solution, which is that we're causing more problems than we're solving. If we got out of the way, the Sunnis wouldn't need Zarqawi to protect them against us, and that they would then turn on Zarqawi and get rid of him. Obviously, now things have gotten to the point where they do need us to protect them against the Shiites, so they probably won't be all that happy if we leave. So I think the idea that somehow our leaving is going to remove the irritant and improve the situation, that argument's harder to make too. It may just be a mess, but the idea that the Mirza solution is a solution seems also to be farther away than it was before. The hope is that everybody is stared in the abyss. They'll see the situation bordering on chaos and pull back the way they seemed to pull back a few days ago.
But again, Zarqawi wants the abyss. And I assume, do they know, is he not the one who blew up this mosque in Samarra to begin with?
No, I assume he is, and I assume he's preparing something bigger.
Right.
But is he the guy mortaring? That's sort of
mortaring's scary. I mean, I guess the good news is you don't yet hear about kind of neighbors taking their assault rifles against other neighbors.
Well, and the glue has been bizarrely Muqtada Sadr, because he's both thought to be the major perpetrator of Shiite on Sunni violence. He's also a guy who values his ties to the Sunni elite and sort of wants to form a Shiite-Sunni alliance against the Americans. So he is both the guy with the most interest in starting the war and a guy with a lot of interest in stopping the civil war. And previously, so he's been sort of a restraining force. Now, there's this other corps, Shiite corps, the Badr corps, that doesn't have this impediment. And one of the theories of this jostling for power in Iraq is that the whole point of getting Jafari out is to get his rival out of the Interior Ministry and into the Prime Minister's office, so his rival, who's the really bad guy who runs the Badr Corps, won't control the Interior Ministry anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's the Interior Ministry. I mean, that's such a mess. I mean, the Shiites seem determined not to let, assuming a new government does form, determined not to let Sunnis have meaningful power within the Interior Ministry. And if Sunnis don't, then to Sunnis, police are going to be synonymous with the enemy. I mean, that's what they've become. It's a mess.
Yeah. This complicated analysis I just went through, if it was incoherent, it's all on Iraq the Model and informed comment.
Well, and one thing I would add is that although Sadr may, in some ways, seems to be a unifying force, he seems to be adamant in wanting the Americans out, which raises the question of to what extent is he really serving Sunni interests, as opposed to getting enough Sunnis on board to give legitimacy to the demand that Americans get out, or playing some other game. I don't have any...
He has all the earmarks of a guy who's just in it for power for himself.
He's a totally bad news guy.
Yeah, but in this case, being in it for power to himself, as opposed to being in it to kill a bunch of Sunnis, it's a more benign impulse.
Yeah. Although,
power.
although himself is a word you should use advisedly. I've heard a lot of speculation that he is not very clever at all, and that there's a power behind the throne, and people don't know who it is. But he's not really ultimately formulating his strategy.
I thought Michael Ledeen claims his speeches are written in Tehran.
I'm not sure if that's where it is, but I have no idea. But there is. He apparently presents himself as a highly non-brilliant person, and yet strategically he has proved a real wily survivor, and has repeatedly pushed things to the brink, and yet survived. So somebody's formulating some subtle strategy there. Well, we're at the 50-minute mark.
And we've moved through all of our 5 topics. So. And
I maintain my zen-like calm through almost all of the Ann Coulter discussion.
Almost.
And you called me when I started to. When you heard the voice rise, you usefully called my attention to it, and I want to thank you for that. I love you, man.
Same here.
A friend of mine emailed after that Ann Coulter exchange and asked if we were still speaking to each other after that dialogue. And I explained that, it's just like professional wrestling, basically, except that during the match, we actually are trying to kill each other.
I was actually worried about this discussion. I thought I might get really annoyed, but I didn't.
No. Your equanimity has never been a problem on this show.
Well, when I snap, it's going to be something.
Yeah, give me warning on that.
Yeah, it'll be like Dan Rather.
Kenneth, what's the frequency?
Okay, something to look forward to.
Okay.
Okay.
See you around.
See ya.